end-to-end management system for EV charging infrastructure, and one of their exciting innovations is a robotic arm for charging. And today we'll get to experience that for ourselves. So ladies and gentlemen, let's have a warm round of applause for Constantin Schwaab from Wirelane. Hello.
If we follow the conclusion that the next generation of vehicles will be fully autonomous, they will be electric, and they will most likely be offered in the transport as a service fashion, then to me it is quite logical that the next generation infrastructure will be autonomous infrastructure.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the afternoon session of this year's ICNC conference. Before you get to see the robot, we'll speak about the utopian future of mobility. I want to take you on a little journey to that utopian future. I think it's a future that we can modify upon our needs, that we must modify upon our needs. So come with me on this journey and let's think about what is mobility. Mobility is a strong concept. It's first of all a vascular system of our globalized economy. There wouldn't be any international trade without mobility. I think a substantial part of economic growth is actually based on mobility. Secondly, it's the foundation of cultural and social exchange. So I think we all agree that it's a good thing that people talk to each other, they go to different places, they exchange ideas. Once again, another fundamental basis of economic growth in our society. So these two things, they seem pretty good things, so that makes mobility a strong concept, an important concept of our present and our future. But mobility is also a pretty big problem. So if you see these images, we are all reminded of our daily life and what mobility means to most of us. If we follow the current trajectory on which we are as mankind, as humanity, we'll get to a point, and I want to introduce a little concept here. There's a law, it's Marchetti's law, Cesare Marchetti, an Italian physicist. He stated that if we change the speed at which we travel, we basically change the distances we travel, but the amount of time we will use each day to travel from one point to the other will remain more or less the same. So we speak about roughly 1 hour per day. So let's think about back in Neolithic times. People would travel about 5 kilometers per hour. That means they would travel 5 kilometers per day. So they would settle somewhere close to their hunting grounds. Nowadays, where we live in rural areas and suburban areas, we can travel up to 20, 30 miles a day because we travel at the speed we do. So if we follow this concept of Marchetti's law, and we assume that by 2050, we will be 7 billion people in global cities, in urban areas, and this is not a number I came up with, this is actually United Nations numbers and policymakers all around the world. They're assuming that this number ought to be true in 2050. So if you look at that number and we do a little more math, according to Marchetti's law, 7 billion people, we multiply the amount of kilometers or miles per hour traveled per day. So if you think that 15 miles per hour, it's a little bit optimistic, well, discount 2 or 3 miles. But we'll end up somewhere around 105 billion passenger miles traveled per day in urban areas in 2050. So let that drop for a moment, what that means. I did some calculation myself, and looking at some more consequences, the first thing I figured out was we need many, many more cars in that scenario. So we would need about 1 billion cars more by 2050 to be able to travel that amount of miles per day. So in case there's anyone from the automotive industry in the room, and you look at your order books, that sounds like a pretty cool plan, right? 1 more billion cars in 2050. So trust me, this is not the situation we want to be in as humanity in 2050. So we got to look beyond order books. Because what it also means is, and this is just one example, if one car occupies the space of an apartment, so now you'd ask yourself, how is that possible? A car, you know, that's roughly 6 square meters. Well, you take the car, you multiply it by 6 or 7, because that's the number of stories you get typically on a defined space. Then you multiply it by 2, because the car not only occupies parking, but also the lanes where you drive the car. So you get to a pretty fascinating number. In Berlin alone, every single car, every new car introduced to the city, if you compare those numbers one-on-one, you will end up with a number of 75 square meters per apartment. I looked that up before the conference. That's the average size of an apartment. You multiply that by 4,000 euro, which is the value per square meter of an average apartment in Berlin, and you'll get to a number of 300,000 euros, and that is just the cost of residential space that is taken away from society with one additional car. So the question is, why aren't things changing? Well, typically policymakers have big problems with big changes because we as society have big problems with change. That's natural. We're conservative as a society. But have a look at this little video and look what Amsterdam did.
In our inner city on the canals, which is a World Heritage, there are lots of parked cars there. Maybe up to 30 to 40% of all public space is being taken up by parked cars. So when the elections were coming up in 2018, I said, well, I make you a promise, Amsterdam, and I will remove 10,000 parking spaces from the city center. And it's an arbitrary number, of course, but it sounded good and it sounded like a lot, and it is a lot. And we somehow won the elections. I don't know if the causal effect is only on this issue. It was very recognizable for a lot of voters.
Yeah, in a way, Amsterdam is not really suitable for cars. So I think it's a great idea. And at the end, it promotes interaction on the streets, it promotes cycling, it promotes walking.
Funny thing is, I read about this, but I didn't read about it in the Dutch press. I read about it, I think, on Twitter from you guys. It's not a big deal here.
It's not a big deal here. So what does that tell us? 10,000 parking spaces removed like that. So if that is not a big deal, the question is, we need a paradigm shift, right? We really need a paradigm shift. So which are the scenarios for a future, for an optimistic future? First of all, we need to design a transportation system that fits our needs, and that transportation system should be designed to certain rules that are universal rules because they were designed and claimed by Dieter Rams, who is the godfather of design, who is basically a big inspiration for Apple and all the other companies that are good in design. And I like this quote so much that I really want to read it out loud. Good design is innovative. I think we can all make a check there. Good design must be useful. And good design is sustainable design. And good design, last but not least, is as little design as possible. So if we follow that rule we just heard, then we get there. This is my bike. You can see I ride my bike every day. This is for my 2 kids. So this is basically a replacement for my car. For the first time in my life, I got rid of my car entirely by mid this year. So we all know that this conference is not made for bikes, right? It's for things on 4 wheels. So we should speak about the possibilities we have, assuming that there's still demand for cars in one way or another. So if we take that design approach one step further and think about the kind of mobility that is possible on 4 wheels in the future, we get to 3 points. I actually took that from Ola Kelenius 2 years ago. He came up with the concept of CASE, Connected, Autonomous, Shared, Electric. Well, connected, I think, is something that you don't even have to mention here, and I'll tell you a little story about connectivity. I recently went on a trip to China, and we visited the headquarters of Huawei. And the chief of global innovation of Huawei, he said, we don't talk about companies as being internet businesses. That's stupid. It's like talking about a company being a business that uses electricity. So connectivity, we have to all assume, is basically the foundation of any other service that can be derived from that connectivity. So let's speak about autonomy. We've heard a lot about autonomy, not only today, but in our lives. It's one of these things. It has almost a religious dimension. To me, autonomy is like soccer, politics, you know. Everybody seems to know something about autonomy. And obviously, I didn't come here to tell you how autonomy is going to work. It's a super complex task. But there's one thing I wanted to mention looking into that utopian, optimistic future. If you look at development, human development, and the development of our knowledge in the past and in the future, there's a pretty interesting thing that goes on, and it's based on a theory by Ray Kurzweil. It's the law of accelerated returns. So what Ray says, he's basically the chief evangelist of Google, and he says that if the pace of knowledge gains is accelerating the way it did in the past, we'll get to a point very soon where there's absolutely no way to make projections into the future. And the funny thing about this is, if you look at innovation and in leapfrog developments in retrospective, we always think that was so obvious. When the iPhone came, sure, I mean, the iPhone came, you know, most obvious thing. But it's not. The problem is, with autonomy, we're here. We simply don't know, none of us, not the specialists, not the average guy. Nobody knows about autonomy. But there's impacting factors we do know about. First of all, the commercial impact of autonomy. Think about the vehicle. The usage of a vehicle, 95% downtime. That's what you get when you buy a vehicle. I had another interesting talk with a young engineer at Tesla. I visited their fab last year in Fremont. And you know, Tesla is famous for having a lot of exchange between ideas. They hire people from all different industries and sectors. So I spoke to this guy who came from avionics. He spent his entire young career at avionics, and he worked for big aviation companies. And he said, the funny thing about car usage is when you buy a Rolls-Royce turbine for the A380, you know, big fat machine, the only thing you pay is thrust, is joule. There's 20,000 sensors in one turbine, and the only thing you pay is when the machine is actually operational. So getting back to the example of car usage, what does that say about autonomy? The economic impact of autonomy is just so big that I'm very optimistic that we as humanity are going to solve this problem one way or the other. And the third thing, what really strikes me is, that's another quote from Tony Seba. He's one of those fast-forward Silicon Valley guys, speaks a lot about mobility. When you combine autonomy, electric drivetrain, connectivity, and you put that all together, what you get is a system where you're actually able to move atoms the way we moved bits in the past. And I think that's a really fascinating concept, and it's not as far away as we might think it is. Because if you look at the mileage, if you look at the training mileage in autonomy, this is a number from Waymo. So what you see on the left side is the 1 million kilometers. This was how it started in the first year of their training period. By now they've gotten to 25,000 miles, training miles in autonomous vehicles by day, which leads us to 8 million miles this year in autonomous vehicles already, let alone Tesla and all the other guys that are researching on these projects. But this is not something that is happening far away in the Silicon Valley. It's actually happening here. It's happening in Berlin, it's happening in Hamburg. And this is a picture of Volkswagen actually doing a trial with an autonomous vehicle in Hamburg now. So the next big concept, we said autonomy, sharing, and electrification. The next big concept, sharing. Car sharing is reality today. The question is, how are we going to turn this into transport as a service? The next big concept. Transport as a service basically means that you get rid of ownership altogether. The question is, why are we not there yet? And what is the counterweight? If you look at it as a scale, what's the counterweight to transport as a service? Well, nowadays, individual ownership comes along with a whole number of advantages, at least felt advantages. And that's an important limitation. Personalization. If you look at a company like BMW, for example, I'm from Munich. BMW is from my hometown. It's the industrial pride of Munich. What they do, and they're really, really good at it, if I order a car, I have billions of options, literally billions of options. Color of the car, seating, drivetrain, everything. And that car will be delivered in some weeks. I mean, that's a fascinating kind of supply chain management right there. The question is, in a transport as a service scenario, how important is that personalization going to be in the future? That's the first question. Second is social status, not to be underestimated. Again, I'm from Munich, so what happens in Munich, it's a yearly recurring scenario. You go to this one street, Maximilianstraße in the city center, and you see people driving around in summertime, you know, in Ferraris, having the fun of their lives. I think it's insane, but you know, it's not to be underestimated. I mean, social status, and they seem to feel good doing that. And as long as that's the case, and people feel good driving around in Ferraris, well, then we're not going to shift towards a society where transport as a service is the new norm. Simple as that. Third of all, and that's even crazier, is the love of driving. So the love of driving is something I felt the last time, I can remember very well, I was 18 years and 1 month old. That was when I got my driver's license. So ever since, it's just gotten first a commodity and now a pain, a real pain. And last but not least, the fear of autonomous vehicles, of AVs. So that fear of AVs is something that's also a recurring thing in human history. And let's not underestimate this. Whenever something new pops up, and this is a big thing, autonomous driving is a very big thing, people are really scared. Funny enough, people are not scared when they're flying in an autonomous plane. Now you'd ask yourself, what's an autonomous plane? Well, every single flight you've done over the last month and years was an autonomous flight. Because pilots they do not maneuver the planes anymore. It's a fully autonomous system. And you wouldn't be scared, right? So it's just a question of how we actually address this issue of people being scared of autonomy. On the other side of the scale, if you look at it, transport as a service, well, the cost is lower, and we will get there in a moment. The cost is significantly lower. The speed of travel is higher. Why? Because we don't have to look for parkings, you know, it's just more comfortable to use transport as a service. We have some more free time, a little bit. If you think of humanity as a whole, think of all the hours we spend in cars, and then basically multiply that with the potential of every single human spending all that time in a car, I think it's the dawn of a new era, the dawn of a new era of productivity once we get there. And then you have income generation, which means that if you give your car away to the wider public, you can share the car with other people, you can make some income of that. And last but not least, the safety issue. In a transport as a service scenario, I think safety will be much, much higher than today. So sharing will lead to the following consequences. If we think that sharing combined with autonomy will take place somewhere in the next decade, then look at those numbers. This is a comparison of vehicle ownership versus sharing. Mileage by shared cars versus mileage by owned cars. And I fear I have to tell you this very ugly truth to the automotives in the room. The white number is your car sales. So it's not a good thing for the automotive industry, and we have to talk about this later in the presentation because I'm scared of that scenario in some ways. Electricity, the electric drivetrain. I think I don't have to convince anyone in the room that the future vehicle, the future of mobility will be electric. However, if you look at the numbers, there's even good reasons to believe, besides the philosophical and almost religious reasons, it's the sheer numbers. So what I really love is whenever I see an exponential curve. Because the power of an exponential curve is so big that I'm 100% convinced the scenario in which all vehicles will be electric will take place over the next decade. This is my personal belief. Over the last 18 months, for a decade, we've seen a perfect exponential growth. A doubling in vehicle registration numbers over 18 months, and that over the last 10 years. What are the consequences? If sharing, if electric drivetrains, if connectivity and autonomy, if all of that is going to happen in the not too distant future, well, first of all, it's going to have a huge impact on your personal spendings, because what you currently do is close to economic insanity. What you see here is the comparison of the cost of usage of an owned vehicle. So what you see here is new internal combustion engine owned vehicles versus transport as a service cost. And how is that composed? The cost difference, the delta between the two yellow blocks, is composed of various factors. First of all, depreciation. A car is a very expensive investment decision. It's actually one of the most expensive investments we make all our lives. And then there's other factors like financing, like maintenance, energy, insurance, and so forth. So you actually get to a point where already today you have a 3.5 times higher cost for ownership of cars than in the shared scenario. And that number will most likely go up to 10x. So now the question is, if that number, the difference, the delta between ownership and transport as a service, goes up to 10x, what does that mean? There's no other market, at least none we know of, where a 10x differentiator in cost has not led to disruption. And that disruption, once again, is going to look like this. This is the vehicle sales numbers. So what's the problem about this? Let us drop for a moment. The vehicle sales numbers, this is United States. Projections on the United States, you know, we're somewhere below 20 million, and that number will go down first slightly and then eventually reach zero, because no one actually wants to own a vehicle like nobody wants to own an airplane today. And once that point is here, we will still have vehicles on the streets, but look at the total number. And if we assume that this is true, this projection is true, we're talking about a third or so of today's vehicle production. And that has a massive negative impact on our society, because we are fully dependent on vehicles. I'm not standing here because I'm a doomsayer, I'm not standing here because I'm cynical. I'm saying this because I really want our industry, our industrial pride, which is the car manufacturing industry, to adapt to this scenario as quickly as possible. On the positive side, if you look at the impact in global cities, urban areas, there's so much vast and open space that will be created by the extraction of the cars, the elimination of cars, that we will live in completely different cities within the next decade. Another interesting aspect, which is quite obvious, you might have seen this car. It's a Sono. It's a fantastic project. It's covered with solar cells. I actually ordered one 2 years ago, so now that I have gone away from car ownership entirely, I have to rethink that concept. But the car is covered with solar cells and basically produces the energy it needs for itself. Well, this is only part of the story. This car is for megacities. It's for short distances. In either scenario, what we will see is that the energy demand will go down by roughly 80%. The tailpipe emission will go down by 90%. And the remaining energy, and now here comes the beauty of the concept of electric vehicles. I have to tell you a story about this. When I started producing solar power 12 years ago, I built power plants, solar power plants, and I actually still operate them in various countries. So I have a long history in solar power. And I remember very well having the discussions with people in the very first period of the ramp up of solar energy. This is never going to work. This concept is broken in its core. This concept is not going to work because you will never reach the amount of solar power needed to meet our energy demands. So there's one simple image I always had in mind when people confronted me with this rejection, and it was this image. The yellow square is the surface, and I'm pretty sure most of you have seen this, is the surface you would need to fuel, to power the entire energy demand of humanity with solar power alone. So it's 500,000 square kilometers. That's all you'll need to power humanity. If you compare that to the space, the residential space that's taken away by the cars, as we learned earlier, it's quite fascinating to see that the cars alone we use today in an ownership scenario take away 168,000 square kilometers. So if we reduce the amount of cars on the streets, if we increase the amount of solar power and wind and water and so forth, we'll actually get to a point pretty soon where we'll be able to create a sustainable system of cars being fueled by solar and other renewable energies. I think this is really fascinating. I love this concept, and it really gets me going every day. So the key learnings are autonomy, sharing, electric drivetrains. That's what we need. So now let's get to the core of this presentation. Let's speak about the infrastructure part. You all came here because you want to learn something about robotics, right? So robotics for me has the history of robotics has a very, very personal touch. I grew up in a factory in the 80s, not literally, but my grandfather, he manufactured injection molding pieces in a factory. So in '82, he imported the very first industrial robots from Japan. Super fancy thing, you know, wooden boxes, Japanese signs written on them. You can imagine me as a little kid, I was 4 years old. So I was super amazed by those robots, but I was thinking, why can't I interact with those robots? So what's wrong with those robots? They're in cages, you know. Seems scary, like what are they doing? So the next thing that happened over the 40 years, almost 40 years between '82 and now, robots became smarter and smarter, and that was because of some driving forces, and I really love this concept. It's the concept of convergence of technology. So if you remember Ray Kurzweil and the accelerated returns of human knowledge, convergence of technology is exactly one of those consequences. So you take one technology, you combine it with another, and you get something completely new, which is not double of what you took, it's more like 10 times what you took in terms of power and robustness. So if you look at the concepts that made robotics so smart that you can actually use them for charging purposes today, there's a couple of things we need to understand about modern robotics. First of all, it's the concept of image recognition. In another panel before, we heard that image recognition, it's very important for autonomous driving too, right? So with robotics, luckily it's a little bit easier, so we don't have to get to an autonomy level 5 driving scenario, you know, where I can go to sleep, read newspaper and so forth. We only need cars that are able to maneuver in a safe environment and autonomously. But the technology we use to foster that application is very similar to that of autonomous cars. So we've teamed up with a company here from Berlin, and we have used image recognition to recognize the charge port of the car, and this is very important. What we did was we tried to create a universal system, a system that works under any conditions. But what we needed for that system was image recognition. So if you combine image recognition with a concept called cybernetics. Cybernetics is a very old concept. It's basically a concept saying that you have one data point, you take that data point, you go back to the beginning, You basically fuel the information you had in the beginning with that data point, then you adjust the entire cycle. So if you look at cybernetics as a concept, and you combine that with the information we get from image recognition, and you pour all of this into a machine learning algorithm, what you get is the ability of a human-like robot in terms of sensitivity, in terms of image recognition, to actually charge a car. Ladies and gentlemen, please meet Costa, the world's first autonomous charging robot that can charge any kind of vehicle. Ladies and gentlemen, please give a big applause to our team who've worked months and months and months to make this happen for today's Intercharge Network conference. I want to go into some more details of this concept. So you would ask yourself, okay, now we've seen there's a robot, we've seen a robot before, there's some imaging technology, so what's the big point? The cool part about this is all of the technology you've just seen is off-the-shelf technology. The secret sauce we've taken is to train this technology over and over and over for a certain task. So what kind of technology do you need? First of all, you need a universal robot, sold 40,000 times globally, industrial standardized product, off the shelf. Then what you need, and that is not so much off the shelf, is Micropsy Technology, our partners from Berlin, who provided the machine learning algorithms to interpret the signals we get. So that's the forced feedback from the robot, so you know that the robot knows when it actually hits the car. What you need is the machine learning algorithm for the image processing. And what you also need is, as a combination of those factors, the right kind of charging equipment which turns this robot into an autonomous charging device. So now the interesting part about this is, and here it gets really fascinating, we've set up, and some of you might have seen it, a little booth over there. A car, a Tesla Model 3, something hiding under a yellow blanket. So the cool part about this is, after having trained this robot for months and months and months and having gone through all this implementation cycle, we've built a library of different categories of cars, you know, Tesla Model S's and other cars. And now what we can do is we can set up this robot, which we did last night. We can set up this robot and we can install the robot within hours to make it show to us that this is not distant future, it's reality. So let me call the colleagues from the other room and see if you're ready for a live demonstration.
Yes.
You guys are ready?
Yeah, we are ready.
Okay.
Just give me 1 second. I will remove the curtain now. And okay.
Okay, ready to roll?
Yes.
Let's go. So please see the first demonstration, live demonstration of this industrial robot charging a car fully autonomously. So be aware, this thing is a collaborative robot. We're not talking about a pre-configured robot like I told you in the 80s. This thing is sensitive enough to stop once it hits a human arm or any kind of object. Ladies and gentlemen, let us dream big, let us get loud, and please come to our booth and realize for yourself the future is here now. Thank you so much for your attention.
so much, Constantin, for your amazing presentation. So I'm sure people actually have a lot of questions, but as he said, just go pay him and his colleagues a visit at the booth to ask anything that you'd like to know about what you've just seen.